After the first blood was spilled, the world did not erupt in sound so much as it sank into a heavy, accusing silence. Imagine a field at dusk, one lifeless figure, the other standing, trembling, and the wind carrying a trace of something that will never be the same. That silence is the first human witness to violence, and it settles over everything that follows. It is into that quiet, into that rupture between brothers that the question of the Nephilim begins. Those giants, whose story the Bible folds into the account of humanity's early fall. The title of this message names the question plainly: the Nephilim, the truth about giants who defied God. But before we chase images from legend, we must listen to the text, feel its weight, and trace how human gifts turned into instruments of domination. The Genesis narrative moves with economy and moral clarity. Cain kills Abel. God judges Cain and sends him away. Cain builds a city, names it for his son, and a lineage rises, one shaped by exile, survival, skill, and pride. On the other side, Eve and Adam's other son, Seth, becomes the ancestor of another line. People who again call upon the name of the Lord, Genesis 4:26. The narrative is not crafting a family tree to celebrate genetics. It is drawing a moral map. Two trajectories open up, one marked by a kind of self-assertion that chooses its own norms, the other by a stubborn, smaller band fidelity that keeps looking to God. To picture this more clearly, imagine two neighborhoods of the ancient world. In one, the descendants of Cain settle, they build, they name, they invent. Jabal becomes known for animal husbandry, Jubal for music, Tubal-Cain for metalworking, names that the text gives us as markers of culture's birth. Their skills are gifts, and the text acknowledges them as such. But gifts in unredeemed hands can become the very means of pride. A city rises, Enoch, and with it systems of influence and power that begin to shape life on a larger scale. In the other neighborhood, the line of Seth remains small, prayerful, dependent on God's ordinance. These are the texture of Genesis's moral contrast. Creativity and skill, either oriented toward stewardship or toward self-exaltation. To make these currents human and tangible, I will use three illustrative figures, parabolic characters named Malak, Nara, and Ardak. These names are not historical claims. Think of them as sketches, teaching lenses through which to see how certain moral choices spiral outward. Malak, born into the line that loved industry, learns the forge. His hands shape metal, and he finds dignity in giving form to raw ore. Na'ara inherits a voice and a skill for strings and song. People gather to be moved by her music. Ardak is larger, not necessarily in stature but in presence. His ambitions reach beyond a trade. He seeks to organize, to command, to establish authority. Watch them as archetypes, the artisan, the artist, the ruler. See how their gifts can heal and build, or how they can become textures of domination when severed from humility. At first, the accomplishments are admirable, even necessary. Civilization needs farmers, musicians, smiths, architects. A society that can make tools and music and settle into cities will flourish. The problem the text is tracing, however, is what happens when those contributions are detached from a posture of dependence on God and reoriented to become ends in themselves. When craft becomes the measure of status, when skill confers immunity from accountability, the good becomes the idol. This is where the term Nephilim enters the compass of Genesis. The narrator says, briefly and enigmatically, that there were giants in the earth in those days. Nephilim, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Genesis 6:4. That single line has generated centuries of debate. Popular imagination pictures literal titans, bodies huge and terrifying. Some ancient traditions and some later writers spin tales of supernatural beings mating with humans, producing monstrous progeny. That is one interpretive stream, and it must be acknowledged respectfully as a tradition with its own history. But the text also sits comfortably within another reading, one the text itself invites when read beside the genealogy and patterns of behavior it narrates. The Nephilim as socio-political giants, the titans of influence, the rulers who use culture and craft to dominate. If you read Genesis as a tale of two moral legacies, the Sethite reading, where sons of God are the faithful line of Seth mixing with the corrupt sons of Cain, or simply the rise of powerful men, helps explain the flow. The Nephilim, then, are those shaped by an admixture of power, prestige, and a warped sense of covenant identity. They are the giants, not because of size alone, but because their influence dwarfs the vulnerable and deforms the common life. In this frame, the giant is a social category. People who tower over others politically, economically, and culturally, and who use that height to impose their will. The narrative shows this through consequences. Where skills become idols, institutions are built that defend privilege. Violence becomes not an exception, but an organizing principle. Control over resources consolidates, and the ecology begins to feel the strain of human mastery divorced from humility. The craftsman's forge, once a place of honest labor, transforms into a workshop for weapons and apparatuses of coercion. Music, which in its best expression reaches hearts toward God and neighbor, becomes an instrument of seduction and distraction, reshaping worship into spectacle. Tubal Cain's metals do not merely provide tools, but secure the chariots of those who would dominate. Jubal's music does not just delight, but creates ritual that binds loyalty to tyrants. Imagine Malak in his workshop when the outsiders come, not to commission a plow, but to fashion armor. He can refuse, but offers of honor and profit corrode conscience in time. Nara finds her songs requested not to lift prayer, but to glorify a leader. Her melodies begin to sanctify a regime. Ardok, the organizer, crafts law and order in ways that advantage his allies and marginalize dissent. The Nephilim are the environment that emerges when these tendencies accumulate. A society where structural power masks itself as culture, and where oppression is woven into daily life. We can observe the social signs the biblical author highlights. The growing spread of violence. Genesis 6:5 describes human wickedness, and every intention being only evil continually. The hardening of hearts, and a decrease of the fear of God. The reverence that restrains and orients. The text's moral geography makes it clear that God's response is not arbitrary. It is a form of corrective justice. Yet even within judgment, grace appears. The text says that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:8. Here the contrast sharpens. Among the swelling of human reach and domination, one household remains faithful, chosen not because of perfection, but by grace to preserve possibility. Pause with me and consider what that preservation entails. An ark is not merely a vessel, it is a counter-community. It is a place where God's remnant, small and vulnerable, is entrusted with stewardship of life. The narrative moves from the scene of creative gifts gone wrong to the work of a faithful few who refuse the prevailing logic. Noah's obedience, then, stands as the blueprint for a faithful response amid cultural collapse. Faithful work that protects life, refuses complicity, and anticipates renewal. Before we step further into the story of the flood, we must slow to examine the language that first draws a crowd's imagination: Nephilim. In Hebrew, the term has been variously translated and interpreted, and scholars continue to debate its precise root and sense. Some read it as fallen ones, connected to a verb that implies a kind of moral fall. Others render it simply as giants, a word that carries both physical and figurative weight. The text's own placement of the term, however, suggests the writer is less interested in physiological description than in the social fact. There were people who, through their actions and their hold on power, exercised a form of dominance that threatened the created order's health. It is important to be explicit here about interpretive humility. One respected reading holds that sons of God refers to the descendants of Seth who married the daughters of men, leading to moral corruption and the rise of tyrannical dynasties. Another tradition, which has ancient roots and has been developed in various non-canonical writings, reads the phrase to mean angelic beings crossing into human realms. Both readings have their proponents and complexities. For the purposes of our moral and theological reflection, we will lean on the Sethite, socio-political frame as the lens that most coherently integrates the immediate genealogy and moral commentary of Genesis. At the same time, I honor the angelic reading as a serious historical tradition. One should never dismiss alternate readings out of hand when the text allows ambiguity. Why choose the Sethite social reading as our working framework? Because it makes the story a warning about human patterns that recur, not just a curiosity about preternatural anatomy. It connects the genealogy, the catalog of cultural developments, and the theological sentence about pervasive wickedness in a unified moral argument. It is this story, gifts becoming idols, culture becoming mechanism of domination, that matters for the church and for anyone who loves justice. When the powerful institutionalize their interests, the common life phrase in specific ways. Economically, wealth concentrates. Land and resources are controlled by a few who hoard and set terms that impoverish the many. The text hints at this without cataloging every deed. The result is injustice across households and clans. Politically, leadership is monopolized under the guise of order. Dissent is quelled, and law bends to serve the influential. Socially, honor shifts from the vulnerable and the humble to those who can pay or coerce. Spiritually, worship dissolves into the praise of success and technological prowess. The narrative of Genesis is watching, with prophetic eyes, how a society that once praised God for gifts now elevates those gifts into altars. This is not merely ancient history. These patterns recur. Notice how the same logics operate when craft becomes the measure of worth, and when influence replaces responsibility. The smith who forges weapons does not inevitably become a tyrant, any more than the musician who composes becomes an idolater. But institutions can capture their work and reframe it. Instrumentalization of culture is dangerous. The smith's products serve new masters. The songwriter's compositions sanctify new liturgies. Think briefly about the ecological consequences the text implies. In a culture that prizes dominion as exploitation rather than stewardship, creation itself becomes a casualty. The soil is exhausted, waterways are burdened, animals are treated as resources to be maximized rather than neighbors to be cared for. The Genesis voice anticipates what later prophets will denounce, a world unbalanced by human pride, in which the Creator's good gifts are misused to oppressive ends. Within this landscape, consider also the small voices, the faithful families, the people who call upon the name of the Lord. They are not political majorities. They do not control the levers of culture. What they hold is the memory of covenant and the practice of dependence. Their insistence that God matters makes them a countercultural nucleus. The text's moral imagination privileges not raw power but faithful fidelity. As the story tightens, we follow Ardok and his cohorts growing bolder. They mock those who dissent. They build a rhetoric that justifies self-exaltation as necessary for order. They point at progress and claim righteousness. The grandeur of their cities becomes a proof text for their authority. The people, many of them, are tempted because the goods offered come with immediate comforts, food, security, and a measure of prestige. But the cost is slow and cumulative. Conscience blunted, neighborly bonds frayed, worship domesticated. There is a subtle human tragedy here. The deceivers are not always caricatures of evil. They are often talented people who began with integrity. Malak once made plows that fed families. Nara's songs once soothed laborers bent under the heat. What changes is not the talent itself, but the narrative around it. Whose name is lifted, what telos is claimed for art and craft, and to whom allegiance is ultimately owed. That is why Genesis places the account of cultural beginnings, Jabal, Jubal, Tubal-Cain, so early. The author wants the reader to see how the seeds of civilization are sown, and how the moral orientation of those seeds determines the harvest. When we read Genesis 6 with this lens, the Nephilim are neither merely monsters nor mere metaphors. They are the social result when technological and cultural ingenuity are divorced from the fear of God and bound up with domination. They are giants in influence, People whose reach crushes smaller lives, whose decisions reshape ecologies and economies without gratitude or restraint. And because the text sees how quickly this pattern can spread, it narrates a decisive divine response. If justice is to be enacted, it must be measured, not vengeful. The flood narrative, when we allow it to speak on its own terms, is both judgment and preservation, a winnowing that leaves a faithful remnant. God acts not in caprice, but to restore a moral order shattered by human choice. The ark, then, becomes an emblem of life-sustaining obedience. It is not an escape to be sought selfishly. It is a commission to preserve and renew. Before we move to the moment the call comes to Noah, before hammers and mockery, the first scoffs from those who have everything to lose, it is worth reflecting on why the story of the Nephilim ends here with such intensity in Genesis. The narrative wants readers across generations to ask, what are the giants of our time, and where do we stand in relation to them? Is our allegiance to God reflected in the way we use our talents? Do our arts, our technologies, our institutions serve life, or do they serve domination? If the Nephilim were indeed social titans, giants who defied God, then the question is not merely historical curiosity. It is a present ethical summons. That summons will shape how we read the remainder of the Genesis account, how we understand Noah's labor, the mockery he endures, the faithfulness required of those who choose the covenantal path. It will also determine how we translate that ancient moral into contemporary action, resisting idolatries of power and cultivating stewardship and humility. And so the scene tightens. Word reaches the faithful household. God sees the breadth of violence, the movement toward institutionalized domination, the fashioning of ritual that praises tyrants instead of the Creator. This word is not merely information, it is a summons that will demand a countercultural life, one that looks absurd to those who profit from the system. Noah is given a task that will make him appear foolish in the eyes of the powerful. He will be instructed to build an ark, an undertaking that, by every measure of ordinary wisdom in his world, will be pointless until it is indispensable. Ardok and others will respond as tyrants often do, with contempt. Where insistence on moral integrity threatens an entire structure of advantage, the threatened will defend themselves. They will mock the ark and those who build it. They will frame the faithful as either naive or dangerous, and the faithful, in turn, must choose whether to withdraw into safety or to engage in the slow work of preservation and witness. Noah chooses the latter. He labors not for applause, but because covenant demands it. We stop here at a hinge. The narrative has mapped the rise of giants, the sociological and moral conditions that produce them, and has set the stage for a radical act of divine correction and preservation. The next scenes will show the collision. Obedience against mockery, the ark against arrogance, the remnant against the dominant order. The tension is not merely between individuals, it is between two ways of ordering human life, domination and stewardship, and the outcome will shape the world that follows. If this is already speaking to you, if the pattern of gifts becoming idols raises the question of where your own skills, your own loyalties, and your communities stand, then take a moment before we continue. Consider subscribing for careful biblical clarity and to follow how this ancient story guides our present moment. There is more ahead. We will trace the practical mockery Noah faced, the theological logic of the flood as judgment and mercy, the silence after the waters, and the covenant sign that redirects history. We will also return to the contemporary application, how the giants of our age look different in the 21st century, and what one small practice this week could mean for moving toward humility and justice. For now, keep with me in imagination. Picture the city lights of Ardok's court flickering against the night, the chorus of instruments tuned to flatter his ego, the clanging of metal as Malak's forge is repurposed for instruments of force. Outside the city in the dust and quiet, a family hammers and measures, assembling planks and sealing seams not for glory, but for obedience. The very contrast of these images tells the story. The giants have their halls, the faithful have their hands. What happens next will show which way the human story bends when God himself intervenes. Ardok's laughter echoed through the courtyard like a bell that tolls for confidence. At first it was a curiosity. What foolishness possessed a man to cut beams when there is no rain in the sky? Then the laughter hardened into derision, and the derision into accusation. What territory does this ark claim? His advisors jeered. Is this an escape hatch for cowards? Are you building a ship to float on the whim of some crank? They called Noah a fool, and they called his sons weak. Mockery is rarely naked cruelty. It dresses itself in rhetoric and a claim to realism. Ardok used every tool at his disposal, patronage to sway artisans who might otherwise refuse, proclamations that painted dissenters as enemies of order, and performances of piety turned to mock the kind of God who would rescue the humble. Some of Malek's former customers were offered more: promotions, access to trade routes, invitations to state craft. Niara was asked to compose anthems of praise to Ardok's brilliance, and when she hesitated, the chorus of flatterers multiplied. Even neighbors who once wondered at Noah's unwavering hands began to murmur that the Ark project was either madness or sedition. Yet Noah persisted, as the text insists, not because he loved wood more than God, but because he trusted a call. His work was a liturgy of obedience, planks measured, seams sealed, animals catalogued and cared for. He did the slow, faithful thing. Even in the shovel of dirt, even in a nail driven true, there was a theological claim. Life matters. Life must be preserved. God's purposes will not be fooled by human archery at the heavens. When the powerful mocked, Noah's steadiness became itself a kind of prophetic indictment. This is the human drama the Genesis account stages. The dominant culture uses its resources to delegitimize the faithful minority. The faithful insist on a different measure. The stakes are not just for the characters in the story. The saga asks us to see the way public morale is built, by narrative, by art, by craft, and by law. Ardok fashions words to cover coercion. Malek's forge supplies the means. Songs sanctify the cause. The consequence is a culture that justifies domination under the banner of civilization. Then the heavens do what the mockers could not do. They open. Genesis describes the flood with simple, relentless language. The windows of the heavens were opened. The fountains of the deep were broken up. Rain fell in torrents. The world the giants had built, the courts, the banners, the proud markets, found no purchase against the waters. The story refuses to demote God to a backdrop. This is not nature punishing humanity at random. This is an act of divine correction, aimed at a society that has become unfaithful to the covenantal order God intended. When the waters rose, there was no spectacle of monstrous bodies fighting back. There was instead the ordinary terror of a world undone. Houses were not dramatic battlefields. They were places where people had lived and loved and failed. Families who had aligned themselves with Ardok's regime found that their life built upon human hubris could not stand the breadth of judgment. The enormity of the flood is told sparsely in the text, not to titillate, but to impress upon the reader that a moral order had been fractured beyond simple repair. At the heart of the narrative, however, is preservation. Genesis says plainly that Noah found favor, a phrase that carries weight across the ancient story. Favor here is not the result of patriotism or cleverness, it is grace. The ark houses the remnant, Noah's family, representatives of animals, the fragile biodiversity of the world. Inside that floating microcosm, life is maintained not for the sake of making the same mistakes again, but for the possibility of a reoriented humanity, one that remembers God and is accountable to the ecology and to one another. There is a theological logic here that we must hold with care. Judgment and mercy are not opposites in biblical imagination. They are, in a profound sense, the two hands of divine governance. Judgment addresses the corruption that makes life unsustainable. Mercy preserves the seed of future righteousness. The flood is not mere annihilation. It is a resetting, painful, but purposeful. The ark is the instrument of mercy. It spares a community charged with responsibility, to steward, to teach, to re-inhabit creation without advancing the idols that once led to ruin. When the waters recede, the story lingers on simple details that are theologically freighted. Genesis notes that God remembered Noah, a phrase that could be read as anthropomorphic consolation, but in the narrative it signals a turning point. The waters abate. The ark rests on the mountains. Noah sends out a dove. It returns with an olive leaf. These images are not ornamental. They are a litany of renewal. Earth is once again hospitable. Life can begin to thrive without the structures of domination that had consolidated. Out of the ark, Noah offers a sacrifice, an offering not of triumphalism but of thanksgiving and recognition of dependence. God responds with a covenant, explicit and solemn. A sign is set in the heavens, a bow placed in the clouds as a promise that the cycle of universal flood will not be repeated. The covenantal language is ethics made cosmic. God binds God's self to a promise that remembers life and calls humanity into a moral response. It is a re-establishment of the intended relationship between Creator and creation. Genesis 9 records this covenant with a clarity that is both reassuring and demanding. The promise of the bow in the clouds is accompanied by instructions about life and community, rules that protect life and restrain violence. The moral grammar of the narrative shifts from the rawness of pre-flood ambition to the expectations of a remade social order. The covenant is not only a guarantee, it is a summons to responsibility. But what happens to the giants who defied God? The flood story tells of the silencing of that order. The structures of domination drown, and the authoritative voices that had claimed monopoly on truth and power are quieted. This does not mean that the tendencies they embodied are erased forever. History, human letters, and the later prophetic books show that the temptation to idolize power remains. That is precisely why the Genesis account is so didactic. It wants future readers to identify the conditions that produce tyrants and to know the price their domination extracts. Here is where application becomes necessary, not as afterthought but as integral to the story's purpose. The Nephilim in Genesis are giants who defied God, and the truth about them is not merely that they were weird ancient anomalies, but that they represent a recurring moral phenomenon. They are social titans, people and systems that use creativity, technology, and cultural authority to concentrate power and silence the humble. They are the elevation of human gift into idol. They are the institutionalization of force. Consider with pastoral seriousness how this pattern appears in our time. Power today takes new forms. Fame offers a kind of gravity. Technology gives unprecedented reach. Wealth furnishes the means to shape public life. Each of these can be good when oriented toward common flourishing. Fame can shed light on neglected needs. Technology can heal and connect. Wealth can build institutions of care. But when any of these becomes an end in itself, when they are pursued for their own sake and wielded to dominate rather than serve, they replicate the ancient pattern of the Nephilim. Think of celebrity that shapes public morality by spectacle rather than by ethical appeal. Think of technological platforms that concentrate attention and monetize relationships in ways that marginalize the vulnerable. Think of economic systems that reward extraction and hoard resources without accountability. None of these are inherently evil. The moral danger lies in treating gifts as ultimate goods, in confusing means for ends, in allowing professional success to become a substitute for reverence. That fragile, restraining fear of God that the Genesis writer regards as the root of right living. If the story of the Nephilim is a critique of idols of power, then the remedy lies in cultivating practices that resist idol-making and reorient individuals and communities toward stewardship. These practices are not mainly techniques for success. They are spiritual disciplines that rearrange desire. They involve humility, accountability, and the recentering of gifts toward neighborly service. Here is one concrete practice I invite you to take this week. Simple, but potentially transformative. Choose one gift or resource you possess, a craft, a professional skill, a platform, a measure of wealth, and use it anonymously for the benefit of someone vulnerable. If you are a musician, Play without seeking credit to comfort a weary worker or a hospital ward. If you build things, offer labor or materials to a neighbor without publicizing it. If you have influence, lend it to an advocate who is working for justice rather than using it to amplify your own voice. If you have wealth, tithe it in a way that is not recorded or boasted about. The point is to break the linkage between gift and self-exaltation, to re-embody the conviction that talents are stewarded, not trophies. Beyond personal acts, the biblical story calls for communal measures. Churches and communities should examine whether their structures inadvertently privilege the powerful, whether their liturgies honor success more than sacrifice, whether their governance invites arrogance instead of accountability. Public institutions, schools, businesses, media should be evaluated by whether they cultivate stewardship and humility, or whether they consolidate unequal power. In all these contexts, the question is not hatred of capability, but love of neighbor. This is a pastoral summons more than a political program. It calls for repentance in the simplest sense, a change of mind that translates into changed practices. Repentance begins with recognition, the kind of interior work that notices when applause shapes decisions, and it issues in acts that rebuke the logic of domination. Faithfulness looks like small, steady obedience, building arcs in our own ways, caring for those threatened by systems of power, refusing to legitimize idols, and teaching the next generation what humble stewardship looks like. It is important to say this gently and without triumphalism. Resisting giant tendencies does not guarantee an easy life. Noah's compliance cost him reputation. It exposed him to ridicule and danger. The remnant's task is costly because it challenges structures that benefit many. But biblical memory is not naive optimism. It is a confident hope grounded in God's fidelity. The covenant after the flood shows that God remains committed to creation, and that grace protects and empowers those who commit to life. We have already seen that the text itself refuses simple answers about some theological puzzles. The sons of God phrase and the precise nature of the Nephilim remain debated, with ancient traditions offering diverging images. That ambiguity should make us cautious about any modern caricature that claims to have uncovered sensational secrets. The strength of the Sethite socio-political reading is that it makes the narrative ethically relevant. It anchors the story in the observable moral dynamics of history, gifts misused, power consolidated, life endangered. It offers a lens to see how human ingenuity can slide into human tyranny. To close this reflection, return to the weight of Abel's silence that opened the tale. That silence named the first break in human communion. The Nephilim were one symptom among many of the deeper rupture. A rupture of reverence, of humility, of the right ordering of gifts. The flood, with its judgment and mercy, is God's dramatic recalibration. The covenant is the divine promise that life will be sustained, and that God will call humanity again into rightness. What does this mean for us? It means that the test for whether we are participating in the spirit of the Nephilim is not how impressive our accomplishments are, but what ends they serve. Do our crafts, our platforms, our successes defend the vulnerable and sustain creation, or do they enrich and empower a few at the expense of many? The measure is neighbor love, stewardship, and humility. Live this week with a deliberate act that reroutes honor away from yourself and toward the good of others. Make one anonymous contribution. Choose one decision in your work or family where you intentionally remove the calculus of self-promotion. Speak up when a system rewards domination, but do so in ways that model humility. Seek counsel, offer solutions, name one's own complicity. Teach someone younger than you the ethics of service in the trade you hold. These small acts are ark building. They are the slow work that stands against the tide of idolatries. There is hope. Genesis ends not with despair, but with covenant. That promise carries forward through the scriptures. God is not done with humanity, and grace remains active. The faithful remnant matters. Our acts of stewardship, small and often unseen, participate in a larger story of restoration. Let us pray. Lord, we confess how readily our gifts become goods for our pride. Forgive us when our work forgets the neighbor, when our success becomes our God. Grant us the courage to choose humility, to steward what you have given, and to protect the vulnerable. Teach us by your Spirit to build arcs of mercy in our homes, our churches, and our communities. May our lives reflect the covenantal love you show, and may we be instruments of renewal rather than instruments of domination. Amen. If this message has sharpened your eye and heart for the warning Genesis offers, the Nephilim, the truth about giants who defied God, please share it with someone who needs this reminder. Subscribe for more careful biblical reflection, and take time to read Genesis chapters 4 through 7 for yourself. Ask the text its questions, and let it challenge you to choose stewardship over spectacle, humility over domination. The story of the giants who defied God is not only ancient history, it is a mirror. In that mirror, may we see our call and answer it with faithfulness.